Hello, and welcome to another episode of Books and the World. I'm Ray Cormier, and I'm pleased to be your host today for another in this long-running series of author interviews brought to you by the Cape Cod Writers Center from the studios of the Cape Cod Community Media Center in Dennisport. My guest today is Jack DeWitt, who has a new book out called Hoochie Coochie Man. It is the third in a series of novels about the adventures of a rogue private investigator named Varian Pike back in the 1950s. Welcome, Jack, and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Great. Would you please first tell us a little of your background? I believe you were a college professor. And,
right.
And what led you to write private eye mysteries?
Well, I was a college teacher for 40 years, mostly in Philadelphia. I ended my career teaching at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. And through that time, I'd been writing about cars. I wrote a book about hot rods. I'd written half a dozen books of poems. But in the back of my mind was I always wanted to do a detective. And so when I was in Philadelphia, probably 25, 30 years ago, I wrote the first attempt at a detective novel. And it was set in contemporary times. It had a character called Varian, but like Spencer and other detectives, he had only one name. And it was okay. And if you know on all the ads that are going on right now, it's not enough to be okay. So I had put it on the shelf and I said, I'm going back to the drawing board. And then fast forward a couple of decades and I said, I'm not going to give up on this. And I started writing another novel, and this time I wound up in the 50s. And somehow that made all the difference. That I just felt comfortable there. I think Varian felt comfortable there. He got a last name and became Varian Pike. And I saw a kind of a future for a series of stories with Varian.
Well, was there something growing up that sort of attracted you to that type of genre?
I think probably it was started with movies. When I grew up, I lived in Stamford, where the novels take place, and there were two stations, Channel 11, Channel 9, WOR and WPIX in New York, and they all had old movies because movies were cheap broadcasting, and every once in a while they would have a movie like Out of the Past with Robert Mitchum, or Laura with Dana Andrews, or some other grade B movie, and I've never forgotten them. They had a big effect on me. And then when I started to think about writing more, I started picking up Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and reading some of the classic Private Eye, and I just fell in love with them. I just thought there was something about that character who was like uniquely American. I didn't think about it then because I was 14 years old and I wasn't thinking in the big picture, but I knew there was something important about that kind of character. Okay. So he was always there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you now live on the Cape.
Yes.
Yeah. But you grew up in Stamford, as you said.
Right.
And where your novels, the three of them. The first one is Delicious Little Traitor, a few years ago. Then you wrote Beat Bop, and now Hoochie Coochie Man. All are Varian Pike mysteries, and they're all set in or around Stamford.
Exactly.
Right? Okay. But on your website, I noticed you said that after decades of living in Philadelphia, something brought you back, rekindled your interest in your hometown, right? Was it something in particular, or?
Well, again, it was a combination of things, but one of the things that led me back to Stamford was also led me back to the 50s. They sort of happened at the same time. There's in the hot rod world, one of the slogans is "Lost in the 50s," and you see it on T-shirts, you see it on plaques on cars. There is this fascination with that decade, the original hot rods. And it's still going on. I mean, it's amazing to me that you can still go to shows today and see Deuce Coupes and 55 Chevys and so forth. So I was working on a book about the origins of hot rodding, and I had to go back and I began thinking about my own past and how that was tied in to growing up in Stamford. And suddenly I began thinking about why Stamford seemed, even though I hadn't lived there for decades and decades, such a powerful effect on my imagination. And I think it was something unique about the times and the place, that the two together somehow just resonated.
Of course, you are going back in time and even in that place. I mean, as we were talking earlier, Stamford now is must be so much different than what it was when you grew up. Now, as you drive through on I-95, it's a mini metropolis with skyscrapers. Right. I suspect it wasn't like that in the 50s?
Well, what Stamford was back then, I think, was, and again, it took me a while to realize this, a kind of complete microcosm of what the country was in that era after the war. It was close to New York, so you had a lot of estates and rich people who were tied to New York, but you also had manufacturing. You had Yale and Town locks. You had Electrolux vacuum cleaners. You had Ronson shavers. You had Pitney Bowes was in Stamford, so you had an industrial base. It was an immigrant community. There was a Russian church, an Italian church, an Irish church. You had there was ghettos. There were everything that was happening in America, bad and good, was happening in Stamford at that time. So you could cover the whole gamut of American experience in about 10 square miles. So,
right. Well, let's talk about the book now.
Okay.
More detail. So in this latest novel, Varian Pike, and please tell me how you came up with the name.
Okay.
He teams up with a mysterious British World War II vet and a beautiful, sexy American psychologist to try to figure out who is setting off a series of bombs in Stamford. And like the first Pike novel, Mysterious Little Traitor, he gets himself entangled in some government conspiracies and wrongdoings. While trying to save the city he loves from harm. So at least two of your books, there's a lot of this government shenanigans going on. Why are you so concerned with government wrongdoing in this era of American history?
Besides my fundamental paranoia and suspicion of everything, one of the things, let me talk about Hoochie Coochie Man first, because part of what Hoochie Coochie Man came from was understanding a program called MK Ultra. I don't know if you know what MK Ultra was. MK Ultra was a program that came out of the Church hearings in the 70s when Senator Church began to look into the CIA and to find all the things that were going on. Well, MK Ultra was a small program that was involved in things like chemical warfare, biological warfare, drugs using LSD. There's some evidence that Ken Kesey and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was tied to an MK Ultra program that had to do with LSD and using it to disorient the enemy. There were a lot of nefarious things, and it fascinated me how the U.S. government could have a program like that. So
and a lot of it took place at a Camp Dietrich in Maryland, which you visit in the book.
Exactly. So one of the things I like to do with all the novels is to take actual events, whether they're historical events or contemporary events, and sort of recast them to look at them through a slightly different lens. So, for example, in Delicious Little Traitor, I try to take sort of McCarthy era, the Red Scare, and that's where the government conspiracies come in. Right. Here it's MK Ultra, but it's also the Mad Bomber. And I don't know if you remember the Mad Bomber from New York, but George Metesky was the notorious criminal in New York because he had been putting bombs in movie theaters, in railroad stations, Grand Central Station, all over for almost 2.5 decades. They couldn't find him. And he partly found with it's the first case of criminal profiling.
Oh.
Because a psychologist looks at the case and comes up with a profile. So it's a mishmash of stuff that somehow I wanted to sort of make work together. And I hope I did.
I noticed you do flavor the novels with a lot of real history. I mean, one example that stood out to me was this mid-air bombing of United Flight 629.
Yes.
Which I said, I'm curious, was this real? And I looked it up, and you had it down pat. Very interesting case. And of course, then you bring in this psychologist who's a student of Wilhelm Reich, and you talk about the prosecution of Reich in the 50s at the same time.
Yes.
So that's you wanted to build this series around these real life episodes.
Yeah, I mean, to me, going back to when I was talking about what attracted me to the detective and the detective novel is that you have this spine of a mystery or a quest or trying out who did it or how they do it, but around it you're free to put in all this other stuff. You know, the other bombings that were going on, a World Series game,
right?
A restaurant menu from the 50s. So it allows you to play, I think, with time. And to me, that's a lot of fun as a writer, to be able to do that. And you don't get too far astray because you have the mystery. And when I did do some novels that were not detective novels, and they would get away from me. Yeah. They would just go off in different directions. So I'm easily distracted by shiny objects.
Does the real history help keep that discipline? It keeps you in the lane, as it were.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. That's what it's for. It's like, so I have a number of things that I know I can use that come out of reality, out of the newspaper, out of history books, and that keeps me focused.
Okay. Good. Let's talk about Varian.
Okay.
First, how did you come up with the name?
Well, when I was a co-op student at Northeastern, I worked at a publishing house called Horizon House, and I was just a copy editor, working on technical papers, microwave, solid state, which I didn't understand at all, but. I had the style manual, so I could function. And there was a company that advertised that was actually a part of the 128 technology boom called Varian Associates.
Oh.
And for some reason, I liked the name. So I wrote a number of stories that had a character, Varian. He was Varian Tingley at some point, or then eventually he just became Varian the detective. And it just became my sort of John Doe. Whenever I would start a male character, I would put Varian in. And as I was working on Delicious Little Traitor, I came across a film about a man called Varian Fry. And I had never heard it as a first name. Varian Fry, Liam Neeson played the character, and he was an American diplomat who, like Schindler, helped Jews get through France, over the Pyrenees, and through Spain, and eventually, and they were very important, Hannah Arendt and Max Ernst and all these artists and intellectuals. And I said, oh my God, it's real. And this sort of gave me a great deal of excitement. And I said, okay, he needs a last name now. It can't just be Varian. So I was thinking, okay, Pike, fish, fry, Varian Fry.
No,
I mean Varian Pike. I blew it. Cut that out. Yeah.
But he's an interesting character. I can see how he might be modeled on some 40s and 50s movie characters. One reviewer of your books, A.J. Sabatini, referred to him as a World War II veteran with a wise mouth, hard punches, and an interest in jazz and cars. But he's certainly much more complicated than that. I mean, Ariel, the psychologist in Hoochie Coochie Man, keeps talking about his layers of sadness that stem from his inability to control the world around him. The Brit who hires him thinks he's independent and resourceful. How do you see him deep down, and how did he develop as you wrote these 3 books?
Well, I think he's getting, some of the layers are coming off a little bit. But I mean, he's a product of a time, and that's why I think the 50s are important. He grew up in the Depression and then in the war. And I grew up watching men who had come through that war and through the Depression. And what I saw was not the greatest generation in the sense of all these, sort of heroic types. I saw a lot of people who had been wounded, and not just physically wounded.
Right.
Men who had to face a world now after going through so much challenges and so many challenges. So it's really about that generation as I saw it growing up.
And challenges that shocked them.
It was very hard. The world didn't make as much sense to them after going, seeing a collapse of an economy, the greatest economy in the world, and then going through a war which was brutal and cruel and oftentimes meaningless when you're actually in the trenches in the foxhole.
Yeah, I did find it interesting. You talk about the layers coming off, that you do reveal only bits and pieces of Pike's background over the course of the 3 books. By learning about him so slowly, I think paradoxically it makes him even more compelling. I think it's a great idea, but why did you choose to avoid that typical full backstory approach?
Well, because I think that's part of the story of this generation. I mean, if you see all of the stories on the various anniversaries of World War II, and you see the generation that followed, they all talk about their fathers and grandfathers as never talking about the war, never talking about anything. Right. Of just accepting this is what you had to do. This is what you had to do to survive. This is what you had to do to serve your country, and not wanting to go into long stories about what I did. Let me tell you about this. They don't. That was not that generation.
My father, my father-in-law, same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So Varian is part of that. He's frustrated by it. He would like to be more forthcoming. There are times with Ariel he wants to break through, but it becomes difficult for him. But it's again, there's glimpses. When he's talking to Lewis about Christmas, and he talks about his father, you get a little bit of a sense of what life was like for him growing up, but not a lot.
Speaking of Ariel, he seems to attract and be kind of irresistible to a certain modern, type of woman who's it's sort of the early feminist types. Is it because he's a challenge to them? Is it?
I think so. I mean, it's many years ago, a woman said, "Don't let women fool you. Women like bad boys." And this was said to me at a time when just sort of Alan Alda was leading the sensitive man idea, being open and all that, and I've always sort of had that in the back of my mind. So there is a sense that when Ariel sort of looks at his hands and looks at his face and says, I know you're hiding something, but I also know that if something happened right now, you'd take care of it. And that sense of his ability to just to respond to the moment, to stand up, is very attractive.
Yeah.
You know?
He's not a crusader, but he's also feels responsible for taking care of either certain people or certain situations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, he has a very simple code. Lewis Diamond, in the first novel, mocks him a lot for
Right.
he's naive, but you know, there's something about, for him, and maybe it has to do with the foxhole, maybe it has to do with being in the Army, that it's the guy next to you and the guy next to you on the other side that you worry about. You're not worried about democracy and truth and freedom and the American way. You're married. This guy, am I taking care of him? Is he taking care of me? Mm-hmm. And so when Benny the bookie gets in trouble with a mobster,
That's in the second book.
That's
Beat Bop.
in Beat Bop. You know, Varian takes some risks. He makes in the real world, he makes a dumb decision to stand up for Benny because Benny looks out for him. So I'll look out for Benny. Mm-hmm. The same thing with Freddie Greenbaum. When his niece disappears, it's like he looked out for me, I'll look out for him.
Yeah. And
that means you don't say, I'll look out for you as long as it doesn't hurt, or I'll look out for you as long as it doesn't inconvenience me. That's not it. You're in.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's a fairly admirable code. I would like to follow it myself.
An interesting feeling I got in reading Hoochie Coochie Man was when the bombs are going off, there's a reminder to me of the tension in Stanford. Reminded me a lot of what it was like going into Manhattan in the days after 9/11. I was working in Manhattan then. Was that intentional, or did it just happen?
Well, I think you can't not be writing a novel now with a bomb in it in the United States and not think about 9/11. I mean, it's just or something that happened after. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have to do very much with that. I mean, I think that was easy to just let the reader fill that in. So I didn't have to oversell that point, I think.
Okay.
If a
so
bomb,
it came very naturally.
Yeah, I think it's part of the situation of just being under threat.
Okay. In your writing styles, I'm wondering about influences, because you mentioned on your website that you worked, I guess he was a mentor to you, was William Gaddis, the great postmodern novelist, who was a difficult read, much more difficult than your novels.
Yeah.
So what kind of influence did he have on you in your writing?
Well, I think one of the biggest influences that he had on me was, it was the first time somebody of some prestige, recognition, talked to me as a writer. I mean, just so we would sit and he.
Excuse me, and this was at UConn.
This was at
school?
UConn. It was in graduate school, and he was writer in residence, and he took on, instead of teaching a class, he didn't want to teach classes. That was not his style.
Okay.
So he wanted to work with a couple of students. So a few students submitted like sample writing, and then he took on a few students, and we got to be friends. And one of those early novels, he helped me with and gave me some support. I blew it about a year later, but that's another story. But he just was intensely interested in the process. So we would sit a lot talking about, sort of getting from A to B. And if you know J.R., which is the book,
yes.
It's like he set himself almost an impossible task, and that is, how do you push a novel forward relying exclusively on dialogue?
It was difficult.
It's very
As someone
hard.
who read that, I can say it's very difficult.
It's very difficult. But it was fascinating to have him sort of open up his process to me, as opposed to just saying, I'm the master. This is what you should do. This is how you should fix this. There were never those kinds of conversations. Okay. So it gave me a sense of, hey, I can do this.
Quickly, you mentioned that you have written some poetry, had some books published. Quickly, how does that fit in your fiction writing? Does it have any relationship to it? Does it help?
Not much.
No.
No, it's almost it's two sides of the brain. I don't know if it's two parts of the brain, like left brain, right brain, but it's whatever part of the brain is, it's split.
Okay.
And I think differently. I write differently when I'm doing it. It's a whole different thing.
Well, we only have a minute or so, but let me remind the readers, the viewers rather, that the books are Delicious Little Trader, Beat Bop, and Hoochie Coochie Man. And where can our viewers find these, and maybe more about you and your other work?
Well, I do have a website, www.jackdewitt.com. You can also find me on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. There's probably a half a dozen to more websites where you can get the novels, and I would be happy to hear in the form of reviews. Anybody who reads the novels, to please post them or contact me through my website.
Okay. Again, Jack DeWitt, thank you so much for being here. Having read two of these three in total, I can say they're a good read, and you tell a good story, and you've created a very interesting character in Varian Pike.
Right.
So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
I really enjoyed
viewers,
it. Thanks, Ray.
We'll see you next time on Books in the World.